Imagine building an aircraft carrier out of ice. Sounds impossible, right? During World War II, the British government not only imagined it, they almost built it. This is the unbelievable true story of Project Habakkuk, a secret wartime experiment so bold, so bizarre, it nearly turned frozen water into one of the most extraordinary weapons ever conceived. In the bitter winter of 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard. The sea was not blue anymore. It was gray, metallic, and endless, its surface broken only by the ghosts of sunken ships. Beneath those cold, rolling waves lurked the hunters of the deep, the German U-boats. Silent, invisible, and merciless, they were the sharks of the Atlantic, tearing through Allied convoys with precision and fury. Each week, merchant ships carrying food, weapons, and vital fuel disappeared beneath the waves, torn apart by torpedoes that came from nowhere. At night, the horizon glowed with fire as the sea burned, the final moments of another convoy lost to the depths. Oil slicks spread like black blood across the water. Britain was being strangled. As an island nation, every bullet, loaf of bread, and gallon of fuel it needed to survive had to cross the Atlantic. And now, those lifelines were being cut faster than they could be replaced. The Royal Navy fought back with everything it had: destroyers, corvettes, depth charges. But it wasn't enough. The U-boats seemed to be one step ahead, one strike away. Even Winston Churchill, whose courage rarely faltered, later admitted, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." This wasn't just a battle for supplies. It was a battle for survival, a slow, choking war fought in the cold silence of the deep. Across the Atlantic, Allied planners faced a grim truth. Their planes could protect convoys only so far before running out of fuel and having to turn back. From bases in North America, Iceland, and Britain, patrol aircraft could cover the outer edges of the ocean, but not the middle. Between those ranges lay a deadly 500-mile stretch of open water where no aircraft could fly and no rescue could reach. Sailors called it the Black Pit. In that gap, U-boats ruled supreme. Convoys entered it knowing that for several days they would be utterly alone. No radar, no air cover, no hope of help. And the Germans waited there, engines silent, listening. When the moment came, they struck. By 1942, nearly 1 in 3 Allied ships crossing the Atlantic never reached its destination. The toll in lives and cargo was staggering. Something had to change. The Royal Navy brainstormed everything: new escort carriers, longer-range aircraft, even floating refueling stations. But the resources weren't there. Britain's shipyards were already at full capacity, its steel reserves stretched thin. And then, out of nowhere, came an idea. One so strange, so utterly impossible, that it just might work. His name was Geoffrey Pyke. He was not a soldier, not an admiral, not even a trained engineer. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant eccentric. The kind of mind that saw solutions no one else could and problems where others saw none. Pyke lived in chaos, unshaven, disheveled, constantly scribbling ideas on scraps of paper. He carried his notes in brown envelopes, forgot appointments, and once spent 3 days locked in a hotel room because he got lost in thought. But his ideas, they were gold. Before the war, Pyke had been an inventor, a thinker, a visionary who thrived on the impossible. He had already proposed mechanical snow vehicles, portable fortifications, and new ways to move troops through extreme environments. Most of his ideas were so unconventional that they made military brass nervous. But desperate times breed strange allies. In late 1942, Pyke wrote a report that landed on the desk of Combined Operations Headquarters, Britain's hub for unconventional warfare. The title was simple, but the proposal inside was nothing short of madness. Pyke suggested building a massive aircraft carrier out of ice. At first glance, it sounded absurd, something out of a child's imagination, but Pyke's reasoning was brutally logical. Steel was in short supply, shipyards were overloaded, and the Atlantic, ironically, was full of the one resource nobody had thought to weaponize: frozen water. Pyke argued that if you froze it the right way, shaped it correctly, and kept it cold, you could create a floating fortress, one big enough to carry aircraft, one tough enough to survive torpedoes, and one cheap enough to mass produce. He even had calculations to back it up. At the right temperature, ice could be made as strong as concrete. It was self-healing. When damaged, the cracks would refreeze. And if a torpedo hit it, it wouldn't explode in flames. It would simply chip away a little frozen wall. To the brass at Combined Operations, it sounded like lunacy. But one man saw potential. Lord Louis Mountbatten, head of British Combined Operations, an ambitious commander with a taste for the extraordinary. Mountbatten decided to take the idea straight to the top. When Churchill read Pyke's proposal, he didn't laugh. He didn't even hesitate. In a short note scrawled across the margin, he wrote, "I think it's a splendid idea. Let's get some experiments going right away." And with that single line, the British Prime Minister had just approved one of the strangest and most daring experiments in military history. But there was still a problem. Ordinary ice simply wasn't strong enough. It cracked easily, melted quickly, and couldn't hold up under pressure. Pyke knew this, and he had a solution. Working with Canadian and British scientists, they began experimenting with mixtures of ice and various additives. What they discovered would astonish them all. By mixing water with a small amount of wood pulp, the same stuff used to make paper, they created a new material that looked like ice but was far tougher. It didn't shatter. It melted slowly. It could even be cut, shaped, and drilled like metal. They named it Pykrete, in honor of the man who dreamed it into being. To prove its strength, Mountbatten staged a dramatic demonstration before a room of skeptical officials. He placed 2 blocks on the table, one made of ice, the other of Pykrete. Then he drew a pistol. He fired at the ice block first. It shattered instantly. Then he aimed at the Pykrete. The bullet ricocheted off the block, zipped across the room, and embedded itself in the wall, nearly hitting an admiral in the leg. The room went dead silent. Then, slowly, the realization sunk in. This wasn't just a crazy idea anymore. It could actually work. The project was now official. Top secret, codenamed Project Habakkuk. The name came from the Old Testament. "Be astonished, for I am doing something in your days that you would not believe if you were told." It was a fitting verse for what they were about to attempt. The proposed ship would be enormous, 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and 200 feet thick. It would be powered by huge diesel engines buried deep inside its frozen hull, and an intricate network of refrigeration pipes would keep it cold even under the summer sun. The ship would be capable of carrying up to 150 aircraft, providing the crucial air cover needed to protect convoys in the deadly mid-Atlantic gap. It was an insane idea, a floating iceberg fortress armed with planes. But in 1943, insanity and brilliance often walked hand in hand. And so, in the vast frozen wilderness of Canada, far from enemy eyes, work quietly began on a small-scale prototype, a secret experiment that would test the limits of science and imagination alike.
They said it couldn't be done, that ice would never hold, that it was madness to even try. But deep in the Canadian cold, under the whispering pines and the watchful eyes of engineers sworn to secrecy, the first pieces of Project Habakkuk began to take shape. A dream was being carved out of frozen water, a dream that might just change the course of the war. They said it was impossible, that no warship could be built from frozen water. But in the lonely wilderness of Canada, a handful of men were about to prove them wrong. The year was 1943. The world was locked in total war, and across the frozen heart of Canada, a strange secret was taking shape. Far from the battlefields of Europe, beyond the roar of bombers and the thunder of artillery, the Allies had chosen an unlikely place to build their dream. Lake Patricia, a remote body of water tucked deep within the wilderness of Jasper National Park, Alberta. It was cold, silent, untouched, perfect. Here, under strict secrecy, a small team of Canadian engineers, scientists, and laborers gathered to begin an experiment that defied all reason, the construction of the first ice ship in human history. The locals had no idea what was going on. Supplies were quietly brought in by train, hauled by sleds and trucks into the woods. The workers were told almost nothing, only that it was a government project. Guards kept the curious away, and even the men on site didn't fully understand what they were building. Only a handful of people knew the truth. This was Project Habakkuk, the plan to build a floating fortress of ice that could change the course of the war. The prototype wasn't large, just 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, a miniature version of the gigantic carrier Geoffrey Pyke had envisioned. But even that was a challenge. The engineers soon discovered that building with ice wasn't as simple as freezing water. It cracked unpredictably. It warped under sunlight. And the Canadian winter, while cold, wasn't cold enough to keep a structure this big frozen solid without help. So, the team began to innovate. They built wooden molds and filled them with slush and wood pulp, freezing them layer by layer into Pykrete. They experimented with different mixtures, adjusting the pulp content until they found a balance between strength and flexibility. Then came the next hurdle: how to keep it cold. To prevent their creation from melting, the team installed a refrigeration system, a web of pipes running through the ice, circulating coolant from small diesel-powered compressors. It was crude, noisy, and temperamental, but it worked. Slowly, day by day, a strange structure began to rise from the surface of the frozen lake. A slab of ice, reinforced with sawdust and humming with the sound of machinery. At night, it glowed faintly under the lanterns, steam rising from the compressors like the breath of a sleeping beast. They nicknamed it the unsinkable iceberg. While the work in Canada continued, across the Atlantic, The concept of Project Habakkuk was becoming a guarded obsession among British military planners. Winston Churchill remained fascinated. Reports from Canada filtered back to London, filled with cautious optimism. The prototype was holding together. Pykrete was performing better than anyone expected. It didn't melt quickly, even in moderate warmth. It absorbed bullets and explosives with surprising resilience. The scientists in London began calculating what a full-scale version could achieve. They envisioned a floating airbase 2,000 feet long, larger than any warship ever built, capable of carrying hundreds of aircraft, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes. It would have steel hangars, wooden decks, and refrigeration systems buried in its icy heart to keep it from melting. It wouldn't need to dock. It could drift in the Atlantic for months, refueled by supply ships, patrolling the deadly mid-Atlantic gap. And the most astonishing part? It would be nearly unsinkable. Torpedoes would do little more than chip away at its icy walls. Fire would be useless. Even if bombed, it would remain afloat, absorbing damage like a glacier in a storm. On paper, it was the ultimate fortress of the sea. Back at Lake Patricia, reality was proving far less perfect. The Canadian winter was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, and the wind cut through clothing like knives. The workers struggled to keep the compressors running, often waking up to frozen fuel lines and cracked hoses. When the sun rose, it brought a new problem. The upper layers of the structure began to soften and sag, forcing the crew to constantly repair the surface with fresh layers of Pykrete. They worked day and night, battling the elements as if they were at war themselves. Despite everything, the experiment began to succeed. The prototype stayed intact for months. It didn't collapse, didn't melt away, and proved astonishingly strong. Engineers fired bullets into it, struck it with axes, even tested explosives nearby. The ice didn't shatter, it flexed and held. In one test, a small chunk of Pykrete took longer to melt in warm water than a solid block of steel would to heat through. It seemed Pyke's impossible dream was actually working. But for all its promise, the project's problems were just beginning. The first was cost. Building even the small prototype required enormous effort and materials. Scaling it up to the full 2,000-foot carrier would demand millions of tons of ice and wood pulp, hundreds of miles of refrigeration pipes, and entire factories dedicated to producing Pykrete around the clock. The logistics were staggering. Then came the question of mobility. An ice ship that size would weigh more than 2 million tons, far too heavy to move efficiently. The engines required to push it through the Atlantic would have to be massive, and the friction against the water would make it agonizingly slow. And yet, the biggest obstacle wasn't physical, it was political. Back in London, skepticism was growing. Some naval officers saw Project Habakkuk as a distraction, an eccentric dream that pulled resources away from real ships. Others worried about the practicality of maintaining such a structure in warmer climates. One admiral famously remarked, "It's all very clever, but what happens when we sail into the tropics?" Geoffrey Pyke brushed off the criticism, insisting that constant refrigeration could solve everything. But the more he pushed, the more resistance he faced. His health began to deteriorate. His eccentricity turned into paranoia, and he clashed with almost everyone, including Mountbatten. Meanwhile, the Canadian prototype continued to sit proudly on Lake Patricia, a ghostly white slab of frozen ingenuity humming quietly in the wilderness. By spring, the weather began to warm, and the structure slowly started to melt. But even as the ice softened, it refused to collapse. When the experiment was finally abandoned, the little prototype remained afloat for months, stubbornly defying the summer sun. Beneath the surface of Lake Patricia, pieces of it still exist to this day, fragments of the world's first and only Pykrete warship, preserved in the cold darkness of the lake bed. For a brief, shining moment, it had seemed possible that a warship made of ice could patrol the Atlantic, shielding convoys from the terror below. It was a dream born of desperation and imagination, and though it never reached the open sea, it proved one thing beyond doubt, that even in the darkest moments of war, the human mind will chase hope through the strangest paths imaginable. But as the frozen prototype melted quietly into the Canadian lake, another storm was brewing across the Atlantic, one that would determine whether Project Habakkuk would ever truly come to life or vanish like ice under the sun. In war, victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the boldest, and there was no bolder dream than this, a fortress of ice built to fight the fire of war.
It began as a spark in the mind of one man. Now it was becoming a blueprint for the most ambitious warship ever imagined, a floating fortress the size of a mountain, made not of steel, but of frozen dreams. In early 1943, the reports from Canada reached London. The prototype at Lake Patricia had survived the winter. The ice had held, the structure had not collapsed, and Pykrete, that strange new material made from sawdust and frozen water, had proven astonishingly strong. For the British High Command, it was a moment of cautious triumph. For Winston Churchill, it was something else entirely: vindication. He had been one of the first to believe in Geoffrey Pyke's idea, and now, with proof in hand, he pushed the project forward with renewed enthusiasm. To Churchill, Project Habakkuk wasn't just another wartime experiment. It was a symbol of British audacity. The idea of outsmarting the enemy, not with brute strength, but with imagination, appealed deeply to him. He once wrote in a secret memo, "Let us go forward with this concept. The advantages are so numerous that it would be wrong not to pursue it, whatever the difficulties." And with that, the dream grew, literally. The plans for the full-scale Habakkuk carrier were breathtaking. The proposed ship would measure 2,000 feet long, over 600 meters, with a beam of 300 feet and a height of 200 feet from keel to deck. It would dwarf even the largest aircraft carriers of its time. To put it in perspective, if the Habakkuk had ever been built, it would have been almost twice as long as the Titanic, with a displacement of 2 million tons, more than 10 times that of the largest steel warships in service. Its massive deck could host 150 to 200 aircraft, including fighters, bombers, and patrol planes. Beneath the deck would lie cavernous hangars, workshops, and storage bays carved directly into ice. Inside the hull, a labyrinth of refrigeration pipes would snake through every corridor and bulkhead, keeping the entire structure frozen even under the sun of the mid-Atlantic. The outer walls would be 40 feet thick, made of solid Pykrete. Theoretically, even the most powerful German torpedo would barely dent it. It would have propellers the size of windmills, powered by an array of massive diesel engines. Some engineers proposed installing as many as 26 electric motors, giving the ship a slow but steady cruising speed of 7 knots. Not fast, but unstoppable. It wasn't just a ship. It was a man-made iceberg, a self-sustaining fortress that could dominate the ocean like nothing before or since. And it had a name, HMS Habakkuk, after the Old Testament prophet who once wrote,
Behold ye among the nations, and wonder and be astonished, for I will do a work in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told to you." The choice was no accident. The project's very existence was a miracle of disbelief. The Allied Combined Chiefs of Staff, led by Lord Louis Mountbatten, began coordinating with Canadian and American engineers to bring the concept to life. Detailed blueprints were drawn up in London and Ottawa. Technical committees met in secret, calculating the exact thickness of the ice walls, the volume of coolant needed, and the logistics of building such a monstrosity in the middle of a war. If it could be done, the Habakkuk would be constructed somewhere in Canada's far north, close enough to ice and cold water, far enough from enemy bombers, and easy access to timber and sawdust. Entire factories would have to be built just to produce the Pykrete. The numbers were staggering: 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 40,000 tons of steel for reinforcements and machinery, 10,000 workers, 8 million man-hours. The project's estimated cost climbed into the millions of pounds, an astronomical sum in wartime Britain. Yet for a time, nobody cared about the price. The Allies were desperate. The Battle of the Atlantic was still bleeding them dry, and victory was far from certain. If Habakkuk could save convoys and provide air cover where no airfield existed, it might change everything. And so the dream of ice pressed forward. But as the dream grew larger, so did the cracks beneath it. The first warning came from the scientists themselves. The more they studied Pykrete, the more they realized its limitations. It was strong, yes, but it wasn't perfect. It warped slowly under pressure, a phenomenon known as creep deformation. Over time, the ice would sag, twist, and buckle under its own immense weight. Even with refrigeration, keeping 2 million tons of ice stable would be a constant battle. The technical reports began to paint a worrying picture. Maintaining the temperature required enormous amounts of energy. The ship's hull would need constant repair, and its engines, buried deep in the ice, might not survive long-term exposure to cold and moisture. Still, Churchill refused to give up. He had a habit of believing that sheer determination could overcome physics, and for a while, it seemed like maybe he was right. In London, Mountbatten presented the plans to the Chiefs of Staff in a top-secret briefing. According to one account, when a scale model of the Pykrete carrier was placed on the table, one of the American generals laughed. "You're serious?" he asked. Mountbatten smiled, pulled out a revolver, and shot the model. The bullet ricocheted off the Pykrete and embedded itself in the wall. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, the laughter turned into applause. If the demonstration was theatrical, it worked. For a brief moment, Project Habakkuk captured the imagination of the Allied command. It was bold, it was strange, it was British, and it might just work. But behind the scenes, cracks continued to spread. The Americans, initially intrigued, began to have doubts. Their shipyards were already ramping up production of conventional steel aircraft carriers, faster and cheaper than anyone had thought possible. By mid-1943, the U-boat menace was finally starting to wane, thanks to improved radar, sonar, and longer-range patrol aircraft. The Allies were winning the Battle of the Atlantic without a ship of ice. Suddenly, the urgency that had fueled Project Habakkuk began to melt away. Meanwhile, Geoffrey Pyke, the man who started it all, was unraveling. Brilliant but unstable, he had become increasingly frustrated with bureaucracy and secrecy. He felt his vision was being corrupted by committees and military red tape. He argued for new materials, new designs, new ways to make the ice stronger, but few were listening anymore. To many in power, Pyke was becoming a liability. He had served his purpose. The project was no longer his dream. It was a government burden. And as the months dragged on, with no progress beyond paper plans and frozen prototypes, the faith that had once driven Habakkuk began to fade. The engineers, exhausted and overworked, continued their calculations, but the writing was on the wall, or rather, in the ice. By late 1943, the numbers no longer made sense. Building the full-sized Habakkuk would take years and millions more pounds than initially planned. The war was moving too fast. The Allies were preparing for Normandy, not for experiments in frozen shipbuilding. In one final report to the Admiralty, the project's chief engineer, Sir Charles Goodeve, summarized the grim truth. Technically feasible, but operationally impractical. That single sentence sealed the fate of the greatest ship that never was. The dream of an ice carrier, once hailed as Britain's secret weapon, quietly melted away under the weight of reality. The files were marked classified, the blueprints locked away, and the workers dismissed. Geoffrey Pyke was left bitter and disillusioned. Within 2 years, he would take his own life. A tragic end for the mind that dared to build a fortress from ice. Churchill moved on to other weapons, other dreams. The war surged forward without Habakkuk, toward Normandy, toward victory. But somewhere, in the back of his mind, perhaps the Prime Minister still wondered, what if? What if that frozen ship had sailed? What if an iceberg of steel and sawdust had patrolled the Atlantic, a cold giant gliding through the fog like a ghost? We will never know.
Every great dream has its winter, a season when even the boldest ideas begin to thaw. And in the final days of Project Habakkuk, the ice that once promised salvation began to melt into memory. It was the summer of 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy was underway. Europe was burning. The tide of war had turned, and victory, once a distant hope, now shimmered faintly on the horizon. But in a quiet corner of Canada, the hum of compressors faded. The engineers packed their tools, the guards were dismissed, and the frozen structure that had once been the beating heart of Britain's strangest wartime dream began to melt silently into the still waters of Lake Patricia. There was no ceremony, no final salute. Project Habakkuk, once heralded as a weapon that might change the fate of nations, was simply abandoned. For months, the little prototype held its shape, stubborn against the warming air. Even in failure, it refused to die easily. The refrigeration pipes corroded, the wooden scaffold sank, but the Pykrete walls endured, slowly collapsing inward like the ruins of a frozen cathedral. By autumn, only fragments remained. When the lake froze again the next winter, the wreckage disappeared beneath a new layer of ice, entombed, forgotten, waiting. In London, the files were quietly sealed. The Admiralty issued no public statement. For a time, even the men who had worked on the project pretended it had never existed. Wartime secrecy swallowed the story whole. Churchill had moved on to greater victories. Mountbatten focused on the Pacific. And Geoffrey Pyke, the man whose imagination had started it all, found himself cast adrift both literally and emotionally. He had given the war one of its most extraordinary ideas and watched it dissolved. Yet even in death, Project Habakkuk left behind something remarkable.
not just frozen fragments, but lessons carved into history itself. The tests had proven that Pykrete was a real engineering marvel, lighter than steel, nearly bulletproof, astonishingly resistant to heat. It inspired a generation of scientists to rethink what materials could do. Though it never became a ship, Pykrete became a symbol of human adaptability, of wartime ingenuity, and of how desperation can turn even the impossible into a blueprint. Years later, when the war was long over and the world had settled back into uneasy peace, divers rediscovered what was left of the prototype beneath the calm waters of Lake Patricia. They found corroded metal pipes, fragments of wood pulp still frozen inside the ice, and faint traces of the refrigeration system, a ghostly skeleton of Britain's frozen warship. It's still there today, deep below the surface, an icy tomb for one of the strangest weapons ever imagined. For historians, Project Habakkuk remains a paradox. It was technically possible, yet strategically unnecessary, a triumph of imagination and a failure of practicality. Had it been built, it might have rewritten the very idea of naval warfare, a floating fortress immune to bombs and torpedoes. Or it might have been a disaster, a melting monument to human overreach. We'll never know. But that's the beauty and tragedy of Habakkuk. It lived in the space between genius and madness, where visionaries like Geoffrey Pyke dared to dream when the rest of the world saw nothing but defeat. In the archives of the British Admiralty, there's a final memo, short, unremarkable, and buried among thousands of wartime papers. It reads simply, Project Habakkuk. No further work is to be done. No flourish, no explanation. Just a quiet full stop at the end of an extraordinary sentence in history. It was an idea born of desperation, built on ice, powered by imagination, and melted by victory. And though the ice is long gone, the dream remains, proof that in the darkest moments of war, even the coldest ideas can burn with hope. The lake where it was built still lies silent, surrounded by pine and snow. Visitors hike past it without knowing what once slept beneath its surface. But sometimes, when the water freezes and the wind whispers across the Canadian wilderness, it's said you can still hear the faint hum of those old compressors, like the heartbeat of a dream that refused to die. A dream carved from ice, a monument to madness, a testament to imagination. The world never saw it sail, but for a brief, frozen moment, it almost did. Perhaps somewhere beneath layers of snow and time, a fragment of that impossible dream still waits to be rediscovered, a reminder that even the coldest materials can hold the warmest ambitions.